Hi, I'm Ethan Levine, and I am the Research and Evaluation Manager at CAST. I'm here today with Nagwa Ibrahim, who was part of the team for our recent project on forced criminality. Forced criminality, also known as criminal exploitation, occurs when traffickers force survivors to engage in illegal activities. That includes, but is not limited to, circumstances in which survivors are forced to use or transport illegal drugs, to commit theft or identity thefts, to commit assault or battery, or to engage in criminalized forms of sex work. These survivors are often misidentified as offenders and may face arrest or incarceration for crimes they were forced to commit. Our project team took a close look at CAST's practices for collecting information on clients' experiences of forced criminality. Our original plan was to develop a brief checkbox-style screening tool to accompany our intakes, but based on team members' feedback, we wound up going another way, shifting towards a much more conversational approach that also encouraged us to provide space for reflection and healing throughout the process. In addition to being more client-centered, this also improved our data collection. We developed an interactive dashboard based on anonymous data from service provision, as well as a guide for anti-trafficking practitioners on documenting forced criminality. And both of those are available on CAST's website and the description for this interview. I'm going to be interviewing several members of the team to learn more about their perspectives on this issue and their experiences working on this project. All interviews are pre-recorded. I've also asked each team member whether they'd like to introduce themselves or would prefer that I read a short bio, and Nagwa has chosen to introduce herself. So welcome, Nagwa. Tell us who you are.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to keep it very short. Again, as you said, my name is Nagwa Ibrahim, and I am the Director of Legal Services at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking.
Perfect. Short and sweet. I love that. So I feel like I just should acknowledge this project wouldn't exist without you. You know, it was really through working with you that I started thinking about forced criminality, that we kind of did any of this work. So I'd love to just hear how that became a part of your work, whether that started at CAST or somewhere else.
So my background is in criminal defense, even prior to coming to CAST, and more specifically working within anti-trafficking lawyering and anti-trafficking law. And I would say that this whole idea about individuals being victimized by the criminal legal system is something that I have always been invested in as someone who's worked in the arena of criminal defense. The ways in which I've seen even clients that I've worked with, even outside the context of human trafficking, being forced to do things against their will in the context of criminal laws and violations of criminal laws, nevertheless being treated in ways where they are not seen as victims when they should be. Right. And so I think, so I sort of came in with that. Then, coming to CAST, really seeing more specifically how it plays out within anti-trafficking work and advocacy, and specifically how survivors of human trafficking experience forced criminality. And despite experiencing forced criminality, are nevertheless, especially survivors of color, nevertheless being criminalized, despite the fact that they are victims. And seeing the way in which that creates further victimization of survivors by the criminal system. And so I really, when I got to CAST, I saw that play out even more specifically when we're talking about human trafficking and survivors of human trafficking.
So when you came here and were first kind of working on this in a specifically anti-trafficking context, were you going that alone? Like, was that understanding common among other providers? Kind of what was that like?
I think that one of the areas that I feel is probably the least understood, and there's the greatest lack of awareness around, is around this issue of forced criminality generally. And I think that it's something that, collectively as anti-trafficking advocates, we need to make sure that we are talking more about, that we are addressing more in various ways. And I think when it comes to, there's two parts to this issue of forced criminality. There's forced criminality in general. So the ways in which survivors of human trafficking are forced to commit crimes against their will by the traffickers,
Right.
sort of forced criminality in general. And then within that, there's when forced criminality becomes a form of labor trafficking. And that's when survivors are forced to commit crimes against their will by the traffickers, and the traffickers are actually commercially gaining from that forced criminality. That can be seen as forced criminality as a form of labor trafficking. And so, one of the things that I feel has been a gap is really an understanding and awareness around forced criminality in general, and then around even forced criminality as a form of labor trafficking. And as a result of that lack of awareness and understanding, victims are getting further victimized and unjustly criminalized within the criminal system. And it's also resulting in individuals being under-identified as survivors of human trafficking because of, particularly around this issue of this lack of understanding with respect to forced criminality as a form of labor trafficking. And then that under-identification is also resulting in individuals not being able to effectively have access to what are their legal rights and access to their rights to resources and services.
So, okay, there's so much in there. And I also want to be mindful of time. So, okay, so when you're talking just specifically about challenges recognizing forced criminality as a form of labor trafficking, are there like other aspects of forced criminality that you feel like are better recognized, or are there areas where we're doing better?
So I think that the most common area of awareness and understanding around forced criminality is specifically when we're talking about survivors of sex trafficking.
Yeah.
And when they're forced to engage in sex work that has been criminalized by the criminal system. Yeah. That is very well understood. And, I think that oftentimes what happens, though, is there isn't an understanding of how that extends beyond sex work that has been criminalized and individuals being forced to commit those types of crimes. So that's understood. What's not often understood is every other type of
literally everything else.
Literally every other type of crimes that individuals are forced to commit by the traffickers, and how that's a form of forced criminality. And then again, specifically within the areas of how then even aspects of forced criminality can then be a form of labor trafficking, like a big example, drug trafficking.
Yeah. So this is a big question that is not on my list, but just any idea why we're so much more prepared to recognize that someone can be forced to do criminalized sex work, but not forced to engage in other crimes?
That's a great question, huh? I don't know why. I do think that you got me speechless, which is rare.
It's a first for me.
It's literally a first.
Yeah.
I think that it is a deeper issue with the ways in which I think the criminal system has been normalized as a system in general. Intervention when it comes to public safety as a whole. And the reason why I say that is I think that people are comfortable with understanding how someone might be. You're not editing. This is all straight through live, right?
I was not planning to, which means even this moment will be live on the recording.
That's fine.
But I can edit if you want.
No, I think let it run. Let it run.
Leave it in.
Real.
Yeah.
I feel like so for example, I feel like people are more comfortable, and I don't know why it is. Okay. So this is where, and I do think it's again, it's because of just the way in which the criminal, so let me back up. So when when I'm saying that I think that the criminal legal system has been normalized as a system of intervention around public safety in a way that's problematic and untrue.
Right.
And the reason I'm saying that is it has been proven time and time again that public safety has not been enhanced through the criminal system.
Yeah.
Now, despite that, though, I think that once someone, even if they are accused and not actually convicted, once they are accused of committing a crime, even though we're supposed to have a system of innocent until proven, quote unquote, guilty, that quite often there's a stigma attached. And I think because of that, people are more comfortable recognizing someone as a victim in the context of criminalized sex work and being forced to do that than in the context of other stuff. So, or other types of activities that have been criminalized. And so, and I think that that has to do with a lot of misunderstandings about the truth around the criminal system, the ways in which the criminal system disproportionately, unjustly targets communities of color.
Right.
The way in which oftentimes people are arrested and accused when in fact those are unjust, false accusations. So, I again, it's not a clear answer, but I do think that it sort of relates to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I did not know when we started this project, but have learned through mostly dealing with federal offenders, like National Institutes of Justice, is that actually CAST's definition of forced criminality is not standard. Right, that we include forced engagement in criminalized forms of sex work, but that most federal institutions and even other anti-trafficking programs only use that term to talk about other forms of forced criminality, right? So the stuff we're not good at identifying.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, it's I can answer questions too. Yeah, so like just for example, the National Institutes of Justice, has now put a couple calls out a year asking for research projects focused on forced criminality. I guess full disclosure, CAST is on one of those projects right now, so we're very engaged. And in their calls for proposals, they specifically say that they don't understand forced criminality to include anything within the sex trades.
Do they say why?
No. They're just very clear that this domain of work, there is, I think in our entire anti-trafficking sector, right across institutions, I mean, the fact that we have the labor versus sex trafficking distinction at all, right? There is this way that anything related to sex is treated as very special.
Oh my God. So now again, we're not going to edit. So I hope
we're not going to edit unless you really want me to.
No, unless I hope folks appreciate this. But I actually think now that you're saying that, I believe actually what it ties to is this idea that to me, it kind of ties to the end demand philosophy.
Okay. What's in demand, Nagwa?
Now we're getting into it.
This is great.
So I think in a nutshell, I think that the end demand philosophy is this idea that if we end the demand for commercial sex work,
right?
If we end the demand for it, that therefore we will actually end human trafficking.
Right.
And then part of the ways that the end demand movement works is in order to end the demand, you actually have to therefore increase criminalization of sex work.
Right.
And so now why I think that this ties in, this idea of like forced criminality being easily understood in the context of criminalized sex work, but not in the context of other types of things that have been criminalized,
right,
is around this idea that I think there's this notion that everybody who's engaged in sex work is somehow a victim.
Yeah.
Is somehow a victim that therefore should be treated as such, rather than this idea that there are those who choose to engage in sex work and we need to honor that choice.
Right, absolutely.
And that is, and so now as we're talking, that's why I think people are more comfortable understanding forced criminality in the context of criminalized sex work, and therefore, as a result, person should be seen as a victim, not a quote criminal, which is also problematic language. But again,
Right.
you know, that's the idea, and that therefore should not be criminalized, because anyone who's engaged in sex work is somehow seen as a victim because of people's moral opinions
Right.
around sex work.
Yeah. No,
And I think that might be why. And I think now that you're even talking about the NIJ stuff, I think that's why.
That makes so much sense, right? There's this kind of snap judgment from the beginning, right? Of
Yeah.
whether you are right in that kind of language, like sort of like victim versus offender framework, that you are one of those or the other. Yeah. So I feel like this is why the work has to keep going.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, with that, I want to shift gears a little bit. So something that came up a lot in this project that I certainly hadn't thought about before was reflection and healing in doing this work. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on that. Did you expect that to be such a big takeaway from our working on how we address forced criminality at CAST? Kind of what does that look like for you?
And I'm good at asking questions back.
That's
Can you
fair.
expand on when you're
Yes.
saying reflection and healing,
Right.
for you, how you understand that? And
Yes.
what you mean.
Yeah. Well, and I do want to honor that, like, this was something that we really heard a lot from external consultants who worked with us on this project. So Carrie Hurdle and Ron Columba are really, I don't think either of those words would have shown up in anything we wrote if not for them. And so I also, I can't promise that my own interpretation is going to line up perfectly with what Carrie and Ron were hoping. I see, I'm used to researchers speaking on behalf of other people, so I feel like I need to go out of my way to explain. I'm not trying to do that. But yeah, so okay, so where that came up for me, like in this context, I think was so on the reflection piece, this recognition that we all have different understandings of our own experiences and other people's experiences. And so in order to understand what someone has survived or what we have, that there needs to be space to kind of learn more and look back. I'm not a trafficking survivor, but I have experienced that kind of process in other anti-violence spaces, you know, like just in particularly, there's some anti-incest work that I've done and in domestic violence organizations, that kind of going into a space, identifying as outside of the survivor community and learning that wasn't true through the work. Right? Which also I feel like goes to show you that I should have known that would be relevant here. You know, this was part of why asking, you know, were you ever made to do anything illegal, or were you ever forced to do anything illegal? Might sound so straightforward, but that could be true without an experience feeling that way, right? You know, one person in one of our meetings, you know, gave this great example of, if this is all your family's ever known, you won't necessarily think that you were forced or made to do anything, right? If it wasn't clear that the activity was illegal, you can't even answer that question accurately.
Yeah.
So that, and then I think on the healing piece, these are very long answers. I think that, you know, actually, I should acknowledge you in this too, because I think Ron and Carrie really pushed us to think about how we need to recognize that everyone we work with as providers is somewhere, maybe in multiple spots in their healing journey at all of those interactions. And so we should recognize that we're always in a healing context. And you brought up that that's also true for us. And also, this is one of my weaker areas around anti-violence work. So I feel like I don't totally know what it means, but I know that it's important to think about for all of us.
Yeah.
And back to you. Yes.
Well, I do love this question, and I want to also acknowledge Jenna.
Yeah, absolutely.
The CAST legal fellow, who's just brought so much insight, even for me, in understanding how we work in this arena in terms of forced criminality, leading and from a space of reflection and healing constantly. You know, I think that I think in terms of the the healing, you know, one of the things that I really appreciated engaging this project was thinking about how do we take every moment of collaboration with survivors that we are working with as a moment of collaboration for healing. And I think it's really important. I think oftentimes people are thinking about only like, oh, the healing of the client or the survivors that we're working with. But everyone is in exactly what you just said, is like we're all in a process and space of healing. And so how do we really, even in every moment, use every moment to ensure that we're leading with this lens of creating a space for healing for everyone involved. And what that means is that's the reflection portion. And to me, that's where like the two have to work together, because part of the healing, part of ensuring that we're implementing a space of healing is making sure that we are constantly in a space of reflection. And that means reflection around how we used to do things, how we're doing things now, but also reflection around what makes sense for that particular person that we're interacting with.
Right.
So it also, so part of the reflection is not applying these cookie cutter approaches. Do you know what I mean? Part of the reflection is acknowledging and recognizing that people have different experiences, even around not just forced criminality, since that's what we're talking about, but even around understanding what that means and making sure to create a space and room and time to be able to honor the different ways that someone might both experience it, as well as understand it, as well as talk about it. And so part of that has been even recognizing, like what you just mentioned, that you can't just have cookie cutter questions when you're talking about this subject with someone, with a survivor that's trying to access service or needing to access services. That, you know, part of it is, you know, like you said, like one of the things that was really helpful in working with Jenna, and that Jenna really brought in terms of my own awareness, is this idea that, you know, if you ask someone, oh, were you ever forced to commit a crime against your will? That exactly what you said. And Jenna's the one that actually really brought this to my awareness. Not everybody's going to know that the activity they were made to do was a quote unquote crime.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it's also about, like, you know, it's understanding that reflection and healing isn't just about reflection, and healing is so much of how we ask questions, both in the wording, both in the tone, both in the openness of heart and mind, that like all of that matters. And that's where, like, even as we're doing this project and putting out sort of guidelines, a huge guideline is you cannot be cookie cutter.
Right. Absolutely.
That's a huge guideline, you know what I mean? And so, and then, you know, another thing that's been really important in this process of the reflection and healing is what always has to take priority is this idea of creating a space of healing where someone feels that they can trust and they feel safe. And that means if it's not appropriate to ask the question, don't ask the question. And that's also been really important in this process in terms of how we approach this issue through the lens of reflection and healing, and really being grounded in that always.
Yeah, I feel like that's a lesson that I probably needed in all of my advocacy roles before this. You know, like a lot of times you're faced with this giant intake form or even just a hotline form, and some part of you feels like you have to try to get all of that information.
Yeah.
You know, and
yeah. Oh, that actually reminds me too, is like, you know, I think another big part of the reflection and this again, and I keep saying both because I think they're intertwined. Part of the reflection and you know, and healing was around really understanding that how important it is to explain why you're asking a question that you're asking, especially when we're talking around this issue of forced criminality.
Right, right.
You know, and that actually led me to apply that same understanding to other questions that we ask that are not around forced criminality.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, one of the things that sometimes I think that we can forget is as much as possible trying to position ourselves as if we're the ones being asked the questions. And you know what I mean? And why, like, if we understand ourselves being positioned as the one being asked the questions, wouldn't we want to know why we're being asked certain things that feel very invasive? And that could also feel like you're asking me to exclude me or to somehow stigmatize me,
right,
or to, you know what I mean?
Which does happen sometimes, right? People share personal
Absolutely.
information with providers and then get denied services.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that, like, because we don't do that at CAST, I took for granted
Yeah, absolutely.
that this idea that that I assumed that I didn't realize that we're one of few agencies that don't do that.
Yeah.
That we're actually asking to be able to ensure that we're providing all the necessary services, not to exclude or deny services. And I didn't realize that other places don't do that.
Right.
It's the opposite. Do you know what I mean? So and that's part of the reflection, and that's part of the healing. Is like, you know, and that's the other thing that was really helpful in this process, is recognizing that the healing process isn't just in relation to healing from the trauma of what happened as a result of the trafficker, but it's also healing from the trauma of dealing with systems.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
have continued to victimize time and time again victims. And those systems are not just governmental systems, they're also nonprofit systems.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, like I've already had to say, I want to be mindful of time. I feel like there's so much. But so I just have a couple more quick. What do you have? Are you good for a couple more? Okay, fantastic. So you've gotten at this a little bit, but just generally speaking, who are you hoping that we can reach through this project? And kind of what messages would you have for those audiences?
So I think that this project is important for not just service providers, but diverse survivor communities, as well as non-survivor communities.
Yeah.
So I actually think that this project is important for the public as a whole, whether you're a service provider, whether you're a survivor of human trafficking, whether you're a survivor of other types of trauma and victimization. I think this project is important. And the reason why I say that is it's important in terms of, yes, understanding forced criminality in the context of human trafficking, but it's also shifting the paradigm in terms of understanding as a whole criminalization.
Yeah, right.
And really understanding this idea that forced criminality can happen in many different contexts.
Right.
Not just in the context of human trafficking. And even understanding forced criminality in terms of being forced to do things that are considered violations of criminal law as a result of systemic oppression and discrimination.
Yeah.
So to me, it is really important in terms of shifting the paradigm in general, in terms of how we understand criminalization and this idea of forced criminality as a whole. Then when we're talking specifically within anti-trafficking work, I think it's very important, first and foremost, for survivors to know forced criminality so that they know their rights.
Yeah, absolutely.
To not be criminalized.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And then, of course, it's very important for service providers and anyone who is working directly with survivors to understand forced criminality so that they are not engaged in further victimizing victims as a result of forced criminality. And then it's really important in terms of understanding when forced criminality is a form of labor trafficking to ensure that those individuals are identified as survivors of trafficking.
Right.
And then given access to their legal rights that includes the legal right to not be criminalized.
So amazing. Last question before we wrap up. If someone wants to learn more about you or your awesome work, where should they go?
Great question. I think they just go to CAST.
That's fine.
On our website. What is it? It's www.castla.org. Am I right?
Well done. Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I was about to mention that. So you've saved me some work here. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Nagwa. This was amazing. And thanks to those of you who joined us to listen to this conversation. If you would like to learn more about this project or about CAST, you can go to our website, which Nagwa just mentioned, www.castla or castla.org. You can also find a link to our dashboard on forced criminality and the practitioner guide that Nagwa and I were just talking about in the description for this interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you.